In this presentation, I'll explore how interviews are used in educational research, focusing on two different studies. I'll critically evaluate how effective those interviews were as a method, with the discussion section being my main focus. So, what are interviews? Interviews are a widely used qualitative research method that involve researchers asking participants questions in order to try and collect data from them. They can be particularly helpful within educational research to understand the lived realities of teachers, students, and educational practitioners. Here is the first study that I'll be looking at. This study aimed to explore Dutch elementary school teachers' perspectives on supporting children who'd been exposed to trauma. 21 teachers from 13 schools were interviewed using semi-structured interviews, and the data was analysed using summative analysis. The key finding was that teachers often felt unsure about how to manage trauma in the classroom. Here you can see some of the core themes that researchers picked out, including the role of the teacher and how to talk about the event. This is the second study that I'll be looking at. This study aimed to explore how adolescents with ADHD perceive and experience stress. The participants were aged 15 to 18, and like the first study, it used semi-structured interviews, but it analysed the data using qualitative content analysis. And the core finding was that stress is deeply intertwined with ADHD. And again, here are some of the core categories that the researchers identified. Moving on to the discussion section. Of course, the main method that both studies used was semi-structured interviews. As you can see here, both studies used similar approaches, beginning with a few fixed questions before moving on to open-ended discussions. This format really allowed participants to express themselves in depth, which was really useful for the topics of trauma and ADHD. Semi-structured interviews enable probing for more information and clarification of answers, and the flexibility of this method therefore allows for the emergence of new themes and discoveries, meaning we're always building upon existing knowledge and gaining new insights. Another strength is that they can be empowering for interviewees, as both teachers and adolescents may have valued the opportunity to express their own viewpoints, struggles, and experiences. But there are some disadvantages to semi-structured interviews. First, environmental and personal factors, like the rapport with the interviewer or participant anxiety, can impact how much information is shared. This variability could have affected the responses in both studies. And there's also the risk of social desirability bias that can lead to distorted results. For instance, a teacher may have wanted to appear particularly supportive of traumatized children, even if in reality they were not. Response inconsistency is another issue, as participants more engaged and interested in the topic may provide fuller responses, which could further skew the data. Both studies used purposive sampling, but with different approaches. In study 1, the researchers used maximum variation sampling, selecting participants with diverse characteristics, like differences in teaching experience, school background, etc. And they wanted to do this to capture a broad range of perspectives. So here's an example. In the visual here, each coloured figure could represent a different level of teaching experience, like pink could be 1 year, blue could be 2 years, and so on. The aim would have been to include one of each to ensure a wide spread of views. Whereas in study 2, the researchers used criterion-based sampling, meaning all participants had to meet specific conditions. So in the illustration, only the red figures would meet the criteria, so others would have been excluded from the sample. Each sampling method had advantages. Maximum variation promoted diversity, while criterion-based sampling ensured a level of consistency. However, study 2's generalizability is quite limited, as all participants had already completed a 14-week DBT course prior to the study. So their experiences may not actually reflect those of adolescents with ADHD who haven't had such training. Perhaps including a non-DBT control group could have offered a broader view of ADHD-related stress. Now I will discuss the forms of data analysis used in each study. In the first study, which, remember, is the trauma-based study, the researchers used summative analysis, where interviewers independently summarized transcripts before then later reaching a consensus. This slide gives more details on the steps that the researchers followed. In contrast, as you can see here, study 2 used qualitative content analysis, identifying both obvious and deeper meanings in the data. I've outlined the steps below. The strength of summative analysis is that it made the data more manageable and systematic, and the use of software improved structure and replicability. However, the summarizing process was reliant on interpretation and subjective opinion, so it could be prone to interviewer bias. Also, encoding the interviews line by line, emotional nuance might have been lost, especially in trauma-related contexts. so fixed format summaries risk oversimplifying complex narratives. Qualitative content analysis was particularly suited to neurodiverse participants, offering a more layered and in-depth understanding of stress in adolescents with ADHD. It could possibly be argued that qualitative content analysis might have been more appropriate for the trauma-based study too. But that being said, one downside is that the richness of data can be difficult to generalize, especially with a small sample size. Moving on to some slightly more general discussions. One strength of both studies is that they delve into topics that are not already heavily researched and highlight practical applications. So Study 1 highlights the need for better trauma-informed teacher training, while Study 2 deepens our understanding of stress among adolescents with ADHD. However, a potential limitation is that they both only consider self-reported perspectives as opposed to actual measurable behavior. And one way of strengthening the studies might be to include observations as well as interviews. For example, in Study 1, the researchers could have conducted observations to witness firsthand how teachers actually behave in the classroom. Also, the limited sample sizes and focus on one single country restricts how widely the results can be applied. Broader research across cultures and settings would be needed to generalize findings. In summary, both studies effectively use semi-structured interviews to explore complex educational issues, teachers' responses to trauma, and adolescents with ADHD's perceptions and experiences of stress. This method allowed for rich, flexible, and in-depth insights, well suited to these sensitive topics. However, there were limitations, like subjectivity, social desirability bias, and difficulties in generalizing data. But that being said, both studies still contribute valuable insights to under-researched areas and highlight the importance of listening to lived experiences in education. Future research could consider combining interviews with methods like observation and expanding samples to improve generalizability and depth.